First of all, by talking about what is the Greenwich Village Historic District. Many people are not aware that while a lot of Greenwich Village is landmarked, not all of it is, and if it's not in a historic district or a designated landmark by the City of New York, it's not landmarked. And therefore, buildings can be demolished. New construction is subject only to the constraints of zoning. So this is a map of the Greenwich Village Historic District. You can see it's very, very irregularly bounded, but just to give you a sort of general sense of the boundaries, that's Washington Square here at the bottom. This is University Place here. 14th Street is up here. It never quite reaches 14th Street. This is Washington Street over here, Greenwich Street over here. That's St. Luke's Place, J.J. Walker Park, 4th Street over here. So a lot of the neighborhood is in it, but a lot of the neighborhood is not in it. And what we're focusing on tonight is the Greenwich Village Historic District. So keep that in mind in terms of what we're talking about today. And by the way, as incomplete as one may feel, the existing Greenwich Village Historic District is, this is a map of what was under consideration in the late 1960s for the landmarking of Greenwich Village, which was this series of little islands, mostly consisting of the big blocks, but with much, much more of the neighborhood left out. So it was a real neighborhood battle to get this single, larger historic district designated. And while it doesn't include everything we'd like, it's a lot more than some of the powers that be at the time would have liked to have seen included. However, the Greenwich Village Historic District is not the only part of our neighborhood that is landmarked. So here is a map from the city's website. The big yellow thing in the middle, that is the Greenwich Village Historic District. All the other stuff that's in blue are other historic districts, which for the most part have been designated in the intervening 50 years since then. So not being in the Greenwich Village Historic District doesn't mean it's not landmarked. There's a lot of other parts of the neighborhood that are. We were certainly a strong advocate and in many cases proposed a lot of these areas for designation. Others were put forward by the commission, other community groups, etc. But, and the little blue things here are individual landmarks. And this map, where it's a very, very dull outline, so I didn't want to just depend upon it. You can see this blue line. This is the Greenwich Village Historic District, but the individual landmarks are a little better highlighted here in purple. So you can see between the yellow and the purple, and just to give you a sort of perspective, this is Houston Street here, this is 14th Street here, this is 5th Avenue here. A very, very good-sized chunk of our neighborhood is landmarked, but not everything. Our neighborhood probably has, if not the highest, one of the highest percentages of properties falling under landmark jurisdiction of any in New York City. And we're very fortunate that that is the case. So let's talk about what the Greenwich Village Historic District means in terms of what being in a historic district does. First of all, it means that any changes to the exteriors of buildings are subject to the approval of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The purpose of the designation of the district, and it's very sort of broad and open-ended, is to preserve and perpetuate the special aesthetic, historic, and or cultural history of the area. It's obviously can be interpreted in a lot of different ways. One man or woman's special historic character may not be another person's. The legal framework for landmark designation comes from the perspective of regulating something which can be enjoyed by the public. So the idea is this is a public good which is being preserved and protected. We often hear from people when there's a proposal for new construction or changes that it's going to ruin or change or affect the view from their home or their apartment. And I always say, I'm very sympathetic, that sucks, but don't bring that up with the Landmarks Preservation Commission because that's not what they're legally empowered to regulate. And if you think about it, it really makes sense. It's not the job of the Landmarks Preservation Commission to pick and choose whose individual lives and views they're there to protect. What they're there to protect and regulate is a broader public good. So when they look at the regulation of a historic district like the Greenwich Village Historic District, what they're looking at is what can a person on the street see? And that's what they are legally empowered to regulate. The Landmarks Preservation Commission consists of 11 appointed officials, all appointed by the mayor. There's various qualifications that they have, but they are supposed to be experts in some way, and the entire premise of landmark designation and regulation relies on the notion that these are experts whose subjective opinion should be given the imprimatur of law. So there is inherently an element of subjectivity to this, and that's important to think about as we think about what are the things that we like, what are the things that we don't like in terms of the Greenwich Village Historic District. What can we change? What can we not change? So I'm just going to read to you, this is from the original 1969 Landmark Designation Report for the Greenwich Village Historic District. A couple of highlights of what they said when they designated this, which by the way was the very first very large-scale historic district in New York City, and to this day is the largest one in New York City. Why they felt, and it took them 4 years and it was a very contentious battle, why they felt it was appropriate to designate this very, very large area, over 2,200 buildings, over 100 blocks if I'm not mistaken, a single historic district. So here's some of what they said. Of the historic districts in New York City which have been designated or will be designated, Greenwich Village outranks all others. This supremacy comes from the quality of its architecture, the nature of the artistic life within its boundaries, and the feeling of history that permeates its streets. What is exceptional about Greenwich Village is its many tree-lined streets, the human scale of so many of its buildings, and the special architectural quality of its houses. The exceptionally fine quality of village architecture, together with its special quaintness, are found nowhere else in New York. Walking through the village, one is struck by the fact that one is in a part of the city which is very different from any other, remarkable for its old world charm, and outstanding as a great historic area of New York. It is the summation, and that's an important word, of these qualities which makes it such a memorable district, one which is not merely worthy of preservation, but one which must be preserved at all costs. In the last 20 years, New York City has lost many of its fine old buildings and attractive blocks of buildings. The purpose of designation is to give an opportunity to city government and the citizens of the city to save from destruction the best of those which are left. There are over 1,000 buildings built before the Civil War within Greenwich Village. The law is clear that both individual buildings and historic districts are to be protected. Preservation of individual historic buildings is undeniably essential in any preservation program, but groups of fine old buildings in fact preserve entire neighborhoods. The protection of just such areas as Greenwich Village was discussed at the time the legislation was passed. So this was new legislation, and they were thinking of places like Greenwich Village when they passed it. Finally, they say the overriding consideration in creating an historic district is the protection of an entire outstanding area, and only the creation of an historic district can halt the piecemeal destruction of such a fine area. So I think what we're here to do tonight is to look at how successful have they been in achieving that goal, and if there are areas where they've fallen short, how can we change that? So let's start with looking at a few things. First of all, I think it's undeniable. Oh, and actually, before I forget, by the way, I wanted to mention that there's also a representative of Controller Scott Stringer who's here tonight. You want to just raise your hand? Yes. So we appreciate you being here. So without a doubt, the Greenwich Village Historic District is a thriving part of New York City. And in fact, when the district was designated and groups like the Real Estate Board of New York opposed it, one of the things they said was, a broad historic district designation like this will strangle a neighborhood. There'll be no investment. It will wither and die. It will crush and destroy neighborhoods. I think they were wrong. Interestingly, now they argue the exact opposite thing, which we'll get to later in tonight, which is that historic district designations make neighborhoods so expensive and so desirable that nobody except the richest of the rich can afford to live there. So we'll come back to that argument later. But without a doubt, what the historic district designation has done is it's helped preserve and protect some very unique and special qualities that you can't find elsewhere, that are in fact increasingly what people look for in places to live. It's the reason why people choose to live in cities, the distinct sense of character, the distinct sense of place, the quality of life in terms of the combination of interesting architecture and lively scenes, quiet respite along with vital commercial thoroughfares. So certainly that's something that the Greenwich Village Historic District has in spades. And I can tell you that if this was not landmarked, none of what you're seeing here today would certainly exist 50 years later. So this is Washington Square Mews. Not to cast any aspersions, but I'm a little dubious that our friends at NYU would maintain these two-story buildings on Washington Mews were it not for historic district designation. So let's talk about some of the other great things that historic district designation does. So it certainly helps with restorations of buildings. It helps to bring buildings that may have been deteriorated or altered or had sort of historic detail ripped off it. Over time, it encourages them to be brought back to real historic authenticity and beauty. So this, for instance, and it's actually technically just outside of the Greenwich Village Historic District, but borders it, is the individually designated Salmagundi Club on Fifth Avenue. This is what it looked like in the 1960s, and you can see most of the facade had been stripped of most detail. This is what it looks like now, restored back to the glory of when it was built in the 19th century. Now, landmarking doesn't require you to do that. Landmarking basically regulates as from the point of when designation takes place. But as time goes on and as property owners look to make changes to their property, the Commission strongly encourages them moving in the direction of restoring or bringing back historic features that might have been lost if they want to make changes. They don't force you to make changes, but they say, hey, if you're going to change, we're going to make you change in a direction of making it more compatible with the historic district, not less. So that's a great thing. Here's some other examples. Folks might know what used to be this building on MacDougal Street at the head of MacDougal Alley. This is what it looked like in 1940. This is what it looked like when it was designated in 1969 and for many years later. This is what, as of 8, 9 years ago now, it looks like now, restored to something very similar to what it had been. And I think arguably a welcome element in addition to the historic district and a change. And that's important to keep in mind that the historic district does in fact allow changes like this. So the historic district also allows new buildings to be built under particular circumstances. And one of the good things about, here's another restoration. This is on the corner of 5th Avenue and 8th Street. This was an old mansion, a rare Gothic style mansion. This is what it looked like at the time of designation, similar to some of the other buildings stripped of all detail. About 15 years ago, it was restored, and a lot of that wonderful detail was brought back, and it really looks wonderful. So again, without historic district designation, a lot of these things wouldn't happen. So here's an example of new construction within the historic district, which had to be approved by the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and it also had to go through a public review process. So the public got to weigh in on what they thought about the new design, and believe me, and some of you I'm sure remember, and perhaps were among these people, the public had opinions about this. This was a parking lot on 6th Avenue between Washington and Waverly, and as you can see, a real effort was made to design a building that related to the history of the neighborhood. Certainly the scale is exactly like what's around it, and while it was contemporary in some senses, it was definitely made to draw on and speak to the vocabulary and the elements of historic architecture in the neighborhood. They also, even though it's actually this very large building that takes up an entire block front, they did a lot of things to break up the mass so it didn't feel like a single monotonous building. If this was not in a historic district, a lot of those things might not have happened. So that's a reason why the Greenwich Village Historic District is in fact a great success. Of course, the historic district prevents demolition of historic buildings. And I'm just going to quickly run through some of the buildings in the neighborhood that were demolished prior to the historic district's designation, so we can see or be reminded of what was lost before we had historic district designation. So this is Rhinelander Row, which actually was just down the block from here, where the what's now the Northwell Health Building was, the old St. Vincent's O'Toole building, replaced it. This was Genius Row on Washington Square South. It's where the Kimmel Center now is. It was the home of many of the great writers and artists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. More Rhinelander. These were the Rhinelander houses on Fifth Avenue and Washington Square North, where 2 Fifth Avenue now is, demolished to make way for that. The Mark Twain House on Fifth Avenue, and the Brevoort Hotel, demolished at the same time in the early 1950s. And this was Rhinelander Gardens, a lot of Rhinelander in here, demolished in the 1950s to make way for PS 41. So this is what happens when you're not in a designated historic district. And sometimes it's at an even broader scale. Blocks and blocks of the neighborhood south of Washington Square were demolished in the 1950s to make way for Washington Square Village and eventually Silver Towers. The original plan, as you can see here, was actually to demolish many, many more blocks than actually were. But what would today be six city blocks were demolished to make way for those 2 developments. This is what they originally looked like. As you can see, they look like the rest of the neighborhood. Little tenements, houses, small industrial buildings. And up here is just one particular example of a house that was in the area that was demolished to make way for that. So one of the things that historic district designation also does, in addition to preventing demolition, is it prevents bad, or hopefully should prevent bad, out of scale, out of character new development. You don't have to walk too far outside of the bounds of the Greenwich Village Historic District to see examples of this. This is East 12th Street between 3rd and 4th Avenues. This was St. Anne's Church, built in the 2 stages in the 1840s and in 1870, along with the Greek Revival Rectory next door to it. This, of course, is what's there now. The bell tower has been sort of preserved, almost like a sarcophagus, and there's a 23-story NYU dorm rising behind it. This is unfortunate. This is from a poster we did last year. Unfortunately, this has now happened. This was the old St. Denis Hotel on Broadway and 11th Street. This is what is going up to replace it as we speak, just outside of the historic district on Broadway. I took this picture 2 days ago. This is just half a block to the north of that. That is Broadway between 11th and 12th Street. This demure structure is totally as of right. The zoning allows it, and I think we could all agree it doesn't really quite fit in with the character of what's around it. Another thing that historic district designation does is prevents the stripping and the alteration of buildings, getting rid of their historic detail. So this is a building which we all know on the corner of 14th Street and 6th Avenue, a very busy corner. It had one of those sort of classic Greenwich Village witches' hats on the top and a really nice cornice. The building was a bit run down, but it had some really, really beautiful detail. This is what it looks like today. This happened just a couple years ago. They ripped the hat off, they ripped the cornice off, and if you go around the corner, this is what it used to look like. So that was the hat with the cornice. This is this lovely little early 19th century building with a nice cornice. Here's a lovely cast iron building next to it with a really rich cornice on it as well. This is what they all look like today. All of that detail just ripped right off. So here again, this is something, and this is just, I guess, about a block outside of the Greenwich Village Historic District. So this is what historic district designation helps prevent from happening. This is in the East Village, just outside of the East Village Historic District. This was always one of my favorite buildings, a tenement, but with this incredibly rich detail. This is what it looks like now, which is very, very sad. And these are just a couple of other examples from other parts of the city here on the Upper West Side. Oh, this is a great one. So this was the Commodore Hotel next to Grand Central Station. You can see it on the left side of the picture. It was built in the, I think, early 20th century, part of what was called Terminal City. This sort of whole complex of buildings that were built as part of the Grand Central Terminal development. They all had a sort of similar style. It was this kind of like brave new city emerging from the railroad connection. This is what happened to the building after our current president got a hold of it in the early 1980s. So this is what can happen outside of historic districts. And here's just another example, again, barely outside of the historic district. The historic district goes right up to here. So this is University Place and 11th Street. These buildings are not necessarily that incredibly distinctive in terms of their looks, but they have incredible historic significance. This building here, number 80 University Place, was Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first woman doctor in America. That was her home and her office. So this was the first place anywhere that a woman practiced medicine. She hung her shingle on this building, and she was a great radical 19th century reformer who was not only interested in being a doctor as a woman, but to serve women and children who did not really get adequate medical care at the time. And then next door to it was the last home of the Cedar Tavern, which of course in the mid-20th century was really the home of the painters, the New York School of Poets, etc. I mean, so many great minds and great innovators congregated here. And this is what that corner looks like now. This is what's been done to the building, so it hasn't been torn down, but it's really unrecognizable. That was done in stages, although I think this most recent version of it is particularly questionable in its taste. And this incredibly generic sliver apartment building, which was built next to it. And then storefronts, which are an important part of what make our neighborhoods work. So this is on 6th Avenue, south of 4th Street. The Greenwich Village Historic District is on the north side of 4th Street. Now, this area we've actually since gotten landmarked in the intervening years, so hopefully, eventually, this won't look like this, and in fact, it's already started to change. But this is what the storefronts south of 4th Street outside of the historic district look like. This is what the storefronts north of 4th Street in the historic district look like. And those are not the original storefronts. They changed over time, but because of landmark designation, they were encouraged to use appropriate materials that really were compatible with the character of the neighborhood. So, from here, I want to talk about, so we've just kind of gone through what's great about the historic district, all the things that it does, all of the bad things that it prevented. Yay, you know, we've got a lot to celebrate and a lot to be happy about the fact that we have this large historic district, but certainly there are issues. One of the first issues that I want to highlight is the fact that there are clearly some parts of our neighborhood that should be in the Greenwich Village Historic District, but are not. So if you look at this map, one of the biggest gaps here is the area along University Place, which we were just looking at, and Broadway, where some of those terrible new buildings went up, which were left out of the historic district, still are. And as many of you know, we've been fighting very hard to get the commission to consider that area. They considered 7 buildings, none of which were endangered, all of which were worthy of designation, but probably would have been much lower down on our list of priorities because there are endangered buildings here. And they've not yet been willing to consider an actual district, which is what this area we think really deserves. And then this whole 14th Street corridor, much of 13th Street and even 12th Street, is also not in the historic district. So as I mentioned, we've been pushing to get this area landmarked. We've submitted a proposal to the city, roughly looking at this area here. These are images of some of the wonderful buildings, all unprotected, located within the that area along the University Place and Broadway corridor. Here's actually a sort of a close-up of them. This, by the way, is Willem de Kooning on the steps of his loft in the 1950s, which was located in this area on East 10th Street. This is the back cover of the book. So all of these buildings, which I'm sure you know, they could be stripped of ornament, demolished, anything at any time. And you all have a handout about this, and the one exception to the don't use your phones during the presentation rule is that if you would like to, and in fact I would encourage you to, want to send a letter to the Landmarks Preservation Commission urging that they take up this proposal and that they landmark this area, just go on your phone to gbshp.org/letter. You can do it right now. All you have to do is type in your name and a couple of other details and press send, and the Landmarks Preservation Commission, the mayor, and the council member for the area will all get a letter from you saying that you support landmark designation for the area. And it's also on the flyer handout, so take it home with you. Do it now if you're willing to. Do it after you get home. Share it with your neighbors. We really want to keep the pressure on for this. And then at the 14th Street corridor, here are just some of the great historic buildings, which again lack landmark protection, and that we really think should be either part of the Greenwich Village Historic District or landmarked in some way. I'm sure you know all of these buildings, the John Dark Apartments, Joan of Arc Apartments, St. Bernard's, Our Lady of Guadalupe, I couldn't think of that, and this wonderful cast iron building on 14th Street. And this is the old Macy's Annex on 13th Street, now a new school building. This is the 13th Street Repertory Theater here. All of these buildings, again, no protections, so what could happen to them in the future very much remains to be seen. So there's some other issues with the Greenwich Village Historic District that we would raise. Ideally, the Landmarks Preservation Commission only allows new construction that's appropriate in terms of design, scale, other things for the surroundings. This was a parking lot on Greenwich Avenue, 13th Street and 8th Avenue, so perfectly appropriate for something to be built there, perfectly appropriate for something of a significant size to be built there. We would argue this design, not necessarily so appropriate for the Greenwich Village Historic District. However, it is a subjective evaluation. The commissioners at the time, in spite of some, I'd say, pretty passionate feedback from us and others, decided that they did feel that this was appropriate. So clearly there's no guarantee that in a historic district you're always going to get decisions that you agree with and you're only going to get the type of architecture that you think is appropriate. Now let me just say this, in the best of all worlds, you're never going to have decisions like that made where everybody agrees on it. You have to accept that sometimes there's just going to be a different way of seeing things. In a case like this, I would say, I think that kind of went out on a limb with this one. I think it's fairly easy to argue that this does not really relate very well to the architecture of the Greenwich Village Historic District. Here's a couple of other recent examples we were not happy about. This is 11 Jane Street, which is going up right now. I think it's just about completed. On Jane between Greenwich Avenue and Hudson Street. Here as well, we raised thoughts and concerns about the garage that was there, but we knew that historically the commission had allowed those kinds of buildings to be demolished. So we didn't expect that they would save the building. We did, however, think that a building that was more appropriately scaled and more appropriately designed for the neighborhood would have been better here. The design did change as it went through the process. There were some things that were improved, some things which I would say were not necessarily that much of an improvement. But here again, these are examples where sometimes the commission, I would argue, doesn't always do what you would ideally like to see them do. Here's another one. Now, this is 145 Perry Street at the corner of Washington. This was a design for a new building here that was approved by the commission that we actually thought would pretty much hit the mark. It utilizes a lot of motifs and design elements that are similar to what you see in that far western part of Greenwich Village, where these big old warehouses. A new person bought the site and decided they wanted to do something very different. They wanted to build a single-family mansion along with a small apartment building for their kids. And they wanted something that looked very, very different. In fact, I would argue something that looked like it should be in Miami or on Rodeo Drive. And the commission, in its ultimate wisdom, decided that that was fine for the Federalist Village. So here's a case where we weren't opposed to there being something built. We weren't even opposed to the scale. The building that was approved is slightly smaller than the building that had previously been approved that we were much more comfortable with. But the design, we would argue, really does not make any sense for the Greenwich Village Historic District. And sometimes the commission gets applications for additions to existing buildings that certainly we would argue, and many neighbors argue, are not necessarily appropriate. Here are a couple of buildings on Washington Place, these really classic Greek Revival row houses, very, very intact from the 1830s or 1840s. And You can see these very, very large additions that were proposed to be added to them, which the commission did in fact approve. And here's another pattern that we often see, which is people proposing very, very large additions on the rears of buildings, where they're often destroying or getting rid of historic material on the backs of these buildings and building these huge additions. So this is another example that was actually approved by the commission. Here's one that's sort of a pet peeve of mine. So this is Twin Peaks over here in the far West Village. Really a classic West Village building. Really speaks to the sort of the 1920s, the era of Bohemia, this sort of quirky exuberance. So a new owner applied to make some changes to the building and went through the staff level approval process. So unlike virtually everything else that we've seen here so far, it didn't go through a public hearing process. Nobody knew that this was being proposed. They said, all we're doing is restoring the building to the original paint job. And if you do that, under LPC rules, you can do it without going through a public process, which I think is great. That's a good thing. The problem is, they claimed that this was the original paint job, but it's not. They submitted black and white photos that only showed the gray and the cream color and didn't show the fact that there were all of these multiple colors all over the building that gave it, again, that sort of bohemian exuberance of the 1920s. So it got turned into this sort of dishwater gray, very bland building without there being any public review and approval process. We brought it to the commission's attention, and we hoped that once we provided them with the information, they would say, "Yikes, our bad. We're going to make them go back and change it." They did not. So these are issues that we certainly see in terms of the commission sometimes. And actually, as many of you are aware, last year and a couple of years leading up to that, we were very involved in the fight to prevent the commission from changing its rules so that more buildings could be approved, more changes to buildings, and more types of changes to buildings could be approved at the staff level. We thought that was bad because while it's not that decisions made by staff are necessarily worse than decisions made by commissioners. They're all fallible, but they all also have a great deal of skill and knowledge that they bring to this. Staff level approvals, like what happened with Twin Peaks, nobody knows about them until they're done. There's no way for us, the public, to say, hey, you shouldn't allow that, and here's why. Here's some documentation that proves that what they're telling you is wrong, etc. So we very much pushed back on that, and the commission, especially under the new chair, actually when the new chair took over, Sarah Carroll, one of the first things that she did was she changed that proposal and got rid of a lot of these proposed changes that would make a lot of these applications only subject to the staff level approval process. So they stayed in the public realm so that the public could continue to comment on them, and we are very happy about that. Just another couple of examples of some of the problems we do see in the commission. So this is a new building that is going to be built, or was approved to be built, you never know if it will be, on the corner of Charles and Washington Street, where there's now an old gas station and a parking spot. So the materials that were submitted by the applicant misrepresented the size of the building as compared to neighboring buildings. This is a building 1 block to the north, which they said was the same height as the building that they were proposing to build. In fact, this is the actual height of that building 1 block to the north. So significantly shorter. And it was some eagle-eyed neighbors who first discovered this and shared it with us. And it wasn't just this one representation. There were several representations where the way they showed the building, I can't say purposely because I wasn't in their mind, it consistently made the building look smaller as compared to its surroundings than it really would be. Now, anybody can make a mistake, but when you make a mistake 3 different times in the same application and it's always in the same direction, I think that tells you something. So here as well, from this perspective, they shrunk the way that the building looked in relation to its surroundings. And in fact, the issue of the size of the building was one thing that neighbors brought up pretty consistently in the public hearing process, as did we. Here's another example. This is a sort of complicated one, and it actually speaks to the issue of subjectivity. So this is on Barrow Street, 1 at 5 This was what was a change to the building, an entryway that was probably made sometime in either the early 20th or maybe even as early as the late 19th century. A lot of people really loved it. I certainly thought it was lovely and wonderful. You can see here that it existed in 1940. It's a complicated story. There was an application to basically to change it, to get rid of it, or to legalize it, having been gotten rid of by the owner who did it without permits. And the owner, among other things, said, well, it only dates back to 1969, so it's not very historic. In fact, the city's own tax records from 1940 show that this was there in 1940. And so ultimately the commission did allow the legalization of its removal. Now on the plus side, what they did here was they actually restored and revealed some historic features in the building, which I think are good and important. In my ideal world, they never would have ripped off the entrance in the first place, but they did. So sometimes there's issues where there could be misrepresentation of historic information, which is what these decisions are supposed to be based on, and that can be really difficult and challenging, and can ultimately affect decisions that are made. Another issue that we hear coming up a lot is that in the historic district, if you have signage in a window and it's more than 18 inches behind the glass, the LPC can't regulate it. So what a lot of people have done, and this is one of many examples of ways in which people have figured out ways to sort of work around historic district regulations. So they just put their sign 1.5 foot back behind the glass and they say, you can't touch this. It's not subject to LPC regulations. And this is 21 Greenwich Avenue, which I'm sure a lot of you know. This was a subject of real frustration for us as well as for a lot of neighbors. Basically, it was left in this condition, exposed with a tarp over it for years on end. You know, the commission did get involved, and they did try to get the owner to do the right thing. But basically, what the owner kept doing was saying, "Oh, we're gonna submit the application, we're gonna submit the work stuff, we'll do this." And then they just sort of stalled and never did it, or they submitted it and then they never did the work. And it just ended up going on and on and on for years. Now they have an application to build this huge new addition on top of the building, which we're going to be fighting. But it speaks to the fact that conditions like this under the current system can sometimes be allowed to exist for years on end, and that's not a good thing. We've also been very concerned about excavations, which you see a ton of in the neighborhood. People are buying these old houses. They're saying they want to dig down 1, 2, 3 levels sometimes, in addition to like building up 2 or 3 levels and then building huge additions on the back. The situation has gotten better in the last 2 years, maybe a year or so, since the Landmarks Preservation Commission has actually hired an engineer that they have on staff, which now reviews these to help make sure that when this kind of work is done, it's not going to damage the building or neighboring buildings. So I'm getting to the end of my presentation here, which is the ongoing issues that we've identified and that I want to sort of share with you, and then also hear from you about what you think are the issues, good, bad, and otherwise, in terms of the district and what we can think about doing moving forward in terms of the future for the Greenwich Village Historic District. So one issue that we've definitely noticed is there is, for better or worse, a lot more new buildings being approved for construction in the Greenwich Village Historic District. And in fact, you know, a lot of the anti-landmarking naysayers will say, you know, landmarking, you freeze everything in amber, you can't ever build anything, you can't ever change anything, you know, it's a stifling system. Well, the reality is that, in fact, so I'll keep talking while Ariel figures that out. So we've actually discovered, we did a report, actually Sarah from our office did this. That in fact there were something like 40 new buildings built in the Greenwich Village Historic District since it was designated. And if you want to check out a little bit more information about what those buildings are, because we cataloged each and every one of them, just go to our website, gbshp.org/new building, and you'll see this report. But so this map shows where all of these new buildings are located. They're all throughout the historic district. And here's what we found in terms of the pace of construction. So from 1969 to 1992, 23 years, there were 14 new buildings built in the historic district. So that's one about every 1 2/3 years. From 93 to 2010, during 17 years, there were 16 buildings built, so about one almost every year. And then just in the last 8 years, from 2011 to 2019, there have been 13 buildings built. So that's approximately every 7.5 months. So the pace is quickening. Now, part of that is because the economy has picked up. There's a lot more building going on in New York in general. Part of it, I would say, is because the commission has become, I'd say, a little more lenient in terms of what they allow to be done in historic districts. And that is definitely a cause for concern for us. So, coming back to this issue of LPC subjectivity. There we go. So simple. If only I thought of it. The issue of subjectivity. So it's important that the commission have this power of subjectivity, and I'll tell you why. We may not agree with what the commission does all the time. I'll tell you who else doesn't agree with what the commission does often. Developers. And they have a lot of money. And they would be more than happy to go to court and sue to change what the commission does if the system were not built so much around the fact that the commission does have this sort of subjective expertise that they're empowered to exercise. So what that means is it's incredibly important that the commissioners be people who have a good sense of preservation and history, and that when the mayor appoints them, he tells them, I'm putting you here to preserve and protect history in New York City, not I'm putting you here, figure that out, not I'm putting you here to protect real estate interests and to allow the maximum amount of construction to go on in historic districts and landmarked areas. So one of the challenges that we face is making sure that these issues are on the agenda for elected officials and particularly for whoever becomes the mayor, because the mayor is the one who ultimately decides whether or not who the commissioners are on the Landmarks Preservation Commission and what they will do. And Vanel, could you
find your note?
So here, some of the other issues are a lack of resources for the Landmarks Preservation Commission. The commission is the smallest of all the city agencies, of several dozen city agencies. They have the smallest staff, they have the smallest budget, and as a result, oftentimes applications take too long. One of the reasons why the commission is very anxious to send applications to staff is because of the lack of resources. The commissioners, with the exception of the chair, are not paid, which is somewhat unusual. And it means that oftentimes violations can take a long time to get resolved, and in fact, they usually depend upon the public to find and report violations. So that's a weakness of the system. One of the issues we often struggle with, and I'm not sure there's a resolution to, is that landmarking, generally speaking, applies to the exterior of buildings. There's a lot of history, architectural detail on the interior of buildings. There are rare exceptions where you can designate the interior of a building, but that can only even be considered when it's a space that is open to the public. So a private home, an office, anything like that cannot be considered for landmark designation, nor can a house of worship. Because of separation of church and state issues, you can't landmark the interior of a church, a synagogue, a mosque, etc. So that's something that we have to figure out a way of trying to improve. Too often we see people, they buy one of these beautiful early 19th century houses and they say, I'm just going to rip everything out on the inside and start all over again. It's their right, but it's kind of a shame. And landmarking is not going to be the way that we're going to solve that problem. The last two issues that I'm going to quickly mention that I do not think are connected to landmarking. Actually, I think if anything, landmarking is potentially somewhat helpful with both of them. but certainly the opponents of landmarking who are out there will frequently raise and contend that landmarking creates challenges for. One is empty storefronts, which we certainly have in our neighborhood. If we ever get this going again, you'll see a map of a study that we did. We actually looked at the East Village, where there's a significant amount of both landmarked and non-landmarked areas, and found that in the landmarked parts of the East Village, there was a much lower rate of storefront vacancies than in the non-landmark parts of the East Village. And in fact, I believe just today, the Stringer's office Controller Stringer's office came out with a report that looked citywide and that showed the same thing, that basically there was no correlation between landmarking and empty storefronts, and that in fact, under certain circumstances, you actually had lower rates of vacancies in landmarked areas, especially for larger retail spaces. And then finally, the last issue is affordability. The one thing that our enemies have been trying to bludgeon us with is to say landmarking makes neighborhoods unaffordable. As if Greenwich Village, if it wasn't landmarked, would be a cheap place to live. Now, if you look at our neighborhood and the parts of it that are not landmarked, for instance, the Greenwich Village waterfront, oh, here we go. So if you look at the Greenwich Village waterfront, for instance, that has some of the most expensive real estate in New York and in our neighborhood, and it's all not landmarked. If you look at neighborhoods where there's been a ton of new construction right near us, just to the north, West Chelsea, Hudson Yards, Williamsburg Greenpoint, Long Island City, those are places where you're seeing prices going up, 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 up. But there is definitely a school of thought out there that's saying landmarking, because it restricts the amount of new construction, it's driving prices up. I think there's more than ample evidence to show that that is not true. I think that theoretically, if you removed all controls whatsoever and let developers just demolish wherever they want and build wherever they want, you'd have a glut of construction, and yes, prices would come down. You'd also have a city that would look like Dubai, and that none of us would want to live in. So in fact, landmark designation, we believe, is a healthy and important part of keeping our neighborhoods and our cities the vital, diverse places that they are. And by inhibiting demolition, if anything, they probably have a slightly positive effect in terms of helping to preserve and protect things like affordable housing. So that is the end of my presentation, except that I'm just gonna, well, at least that's up there. There were one or two slides that you didn't get to see, but that's fine, we can come back to it later. I appreciate your patience, sorry for the technical snafus. And now I wanna basically open it up to you to hear from you your thoughts about the Greenwich Village Historic District and what we like, what we want to change, etc. And this is actually perfect timing because I see Assemblymember Deborah Glick has just joined us. Thank you for being here and for your co-sponsorship. And Deborah, whether it's now or at any point, if you want to say a few words, we're of course always happy to hear from you.
I just want to thank Village Preservation for its decades of dedication to keeping our communities protected, low-rise, and to fight against inappropriate intrusions, which, you know, is yeoman's work. So we've worked with Andrew for a very long time, and we are grateful for everybody who participates, because it's not just the staff, it's the board, and it's individuals who participate as members or interested neighborhood parties. We love where we live, and we're all desperately concerned. I gave a proclamation yesterday to the Narrows, which is a pastry shop in the East Village. It's been there for 125 years. And very few things last, 50 years. So this is a struggle to maintain what we have and to ensure that whatever rules change or whatever personnel change, that we keep our eye on what we need to keep the historic district looking as it should. And thank you, Andrew, for everything that you do.
Somebody who's worked with so closely on so many issues and who's been such a help and support on many of the fights that we've sort of talked about here. So I want to open it up to you. Get your thoughts, ideas. Where do we go from here for the next 50 years in the Greenwich Village Historic District? Yes?
I sort of just a bit of curiosity. I noticed that Spruce Garden is not in the historic district. Is that because it's not in the structure, or because the buildings right along it are landmarked according to the map? But I noticed the garden wasn't.
Ariel, can you get this working? Actually, the entire St. Luke's block is in the Greenwich Village Historic District, so it's all included within the district. Now, things like gardens are regulated a little bit differently than buildings. The LPC doesn't. Oh, great. Perfect. And for some reason it wasn't when I was doing it. Thank you. Ariel has the magic touch. So if I can just bring that map back up, I can show you. There we go. Yeah, so the... this is J.J. Walker Park here, is that what you mean? Because this is the St. Luke's block here. Yeah. Right. J.J. Walker Park is not in the historic district. Yes, ma'am.
If you disagree with a decision made by the commission, do you have any recourse?
That's a great question, and certainly people do disagree at times with the commission, whether it's us, whether it's developers. With any decision that a city agency makes, you can file what's called an Article 78. I believe that there is not a single case of a challenge of an LPC decision that's ever been successful other than on procedural grounds. And actually Simeon could probably fill us in even more on this. But generally speaking, because the way the law is structured, which is that it says that the LPC has this discretion to, in their expert judgment, decide how we apply these principles, it's incredibly rare that if it's something that's a matter of opinion. Now, if they took a vote and they didn't follow the proper procedure or process, I believe there's been a couple of occasions. And actually, let me introduce Simeon Bankoff from the Historic District Council. Simeon, is there anything you want to add to or correct about that?
No, you covered it pretty well. Something people might be familiar with was the recent fight in the Gansevoort Market, where the community, probably people in this room, fought very hard to rescind and fought against what the Landmarks Commission allowed to build what they felt to be a tower in the market. And at the end of the day, the courts felt that the Landmarks Commission had done their job properly. They're an expert agency, and that allowed their decision to stand. There have been cases, a few of them, where, as Andrew said, for procedural reasons, the Landmarks Commission didn't properly, dot their I's or cross their T's with regards to giving permissions. But it's very rare, and it's a very expensive and time-consuming task.
And oftentimes, at best, all it forces them to do is go back and follow
revisit
the
it,
procedure
yeah.
and come up with the exact same outcome. It's why, typically, when people approach us and say, this is outrageous, we should sue, we say, look, you're welcome to if that's how you want to spend your money. You should be aware that the track record is that that's virtually never successful. And even when we've passionately disagreed with the LPC's decisions, there's some good things about that, because trust me, the other side has way more resources to sue the LPC when they don't like their decisions. And in general, we want the decisions of the commission to be upheld. What this speaks to is we want them to make good decisions that really are designed to preserve and protect history and character. And what that brings it back to is the fact that we have to make sure that the right people, especially the chair is the most powerful member of the commission in many ways, that the people who are appointed to those positions share those qualities and those philosophies.
Thank you, Andrew. You said that a study GBSHP, I can't get rid of those. A GBSHP study said that there were fewer empty storefronts
I'll bring that up.
in East Village within the landmark parts. Can you drill down a little, what do you think the correlation is?
So we, unlike our friends at the Real Estate Board in New York, we don't think that correlation and causality are the same thing. So they will frequently say, oh, we've cherry-picked, one place where this happens and it's landmarked and this bad thing is happening, therefore landmarking causes this. So what I can say is, so this is the map. So this is the East Village, the stuff that's inside the blue. And you can see it covers a good part of the neighborhood. That's the landmarked areas. The stuff that's outside of it is not. You can see that in the historic districts, 7% storefront vacancy. In the overall in the neighborhood, 15%. And if you take out the historic parts, I think it's roughly 17%. In some areas and on some thoroughfares, it's as high as 31%. I think that historic districts tend to attract foot traffic. They tend to attract investment. They tend to less frequently have big box stores, which sometimes are very successful and sometimes then fold up and you've got this huge empty space. So I'm not in any way going to say landmarking causes lower retail vacancies, but I think that what you do tend to see overall in historic districts is you tend to see pretty healthy retail environments. And at the very least, the claim that Redney tried to make, which was that landmarking was a cause of vacant storefronts, there is absolutely no basis in fact to that whatsoever. Mike?
I would like to address the issue that you raised earlier about rooftop additions and additions to buildings. My understanding is that it's not visible from the street. It is not subject to the public review process. And I think that is incorrect measure aiming at that point.
I hear you.
I'll repeat what he said if anyone can't hear it.
I live on 10th Street, one of the most beautiful blocks in the village. They're all beautiful. And I face 11th Street, which is another beautiful block. But I'm in the back, and I see the rooftop additions and the rear additions changing the rear facade and the rooftops of so many buildings on 11th Street. A lot of the historic fabric is being lost, and nothing can be done to preserve it. I've seen 3-story additions from my window that are totally not visible from the street, which changes the character of these wonderful buildings we have throughout the historic district. My question to Andrew and to Simeon and to the others in the room is, what can we do to change the legislation that would make any addition to a building in the historic district or an individually designated historic building subject to a public review process so that we could see what's being added to the back of the building even though we may not be able to see it from the street. It changes the character of the building and destroys historic fabric. I'd like to see that on the agenda of the society as soon as possible in the coming years.
It's a good question, and it's an issue we struggle and grapple with, and you can see that's why we included it in our presentation. So the way it works now is if you propose to add on top of a building in a way that is not visible from the street, you can get approval at staff level from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. If it is in any way visible from the street, or I believe the terminology is more than minimally visible, then it has to go through the public review process, and the commission can approve it, but it has to go through sort of a public process. Mike, what I would say is, given the way in which the law is structured around this concept of the public enjoyment, I'm not sure I know that could be changed. The issue of the commission making decisions for when it is visible from the public right-of-way, that is something that could be changed, and that's a decision that the commission makes on a case-by-case basis, and we can argue that they, whether it's in an individual case or across the board, should be making different decisions. I don't know that the law could be changed to require that something that's not visible from the public right-of-way would have to go through the public review process. But Simeon, do you have any different thoughts?
Just a little nuance is that you can only build I believe it is one-story additions that are invisible from the public way. If you do a two-story addition, even if it is invisible from the public way, it needs to go through the landmarks public review process, is my remembrance of this. Similarly,
Is that from the new rules or the old rules?
it's the old rules, and they've made it even clearer that there is, you can go up one floor, but you can't go up two. Similarly, there's something with rear yard additions, which are another major problem throughout the city, because as much as you hate looking at rooftop additions, rear yard additions often directly affect their neighbors, but there's only a certain size that can be allowed as a sort of by staff level. Once you get above that size, you have to go to the public through the public review process. So that's, yeah.
So we're going to take notes on some of these things: rooftop additions and public review. Forgive my carpal tunnel handwriting. I believe we had a question over here. Yes.
I walked up Greenwich Street to 21st. I think there was 12 vacant floors. Is that because of the rents? Is that historic district?
So this was Christopher between.
Hudson and Creeper.
Yes, that is within the historic district, and there are a lot of, Christopher Street has certainly been struggling retail-wise for quite some time. I don't know that there's a single explanation for why. Christopher Street and in a different way, Bleecker Street, which intersects not far from there, has had a lot of retail vacancies. I think the dynamics are somewhat different. It's sometimes been referred to as high-end blight. I mean, here you are in the middle of the West Village, which is this incredibly desirable, increasingly affluent neighborhood, but there's this huge number of retail vacancies. I know that there's some work being done on Bleecker Street to try to change that. They're bringing in some sort of temporary startups and pop-ups. Christopher Street, I think, has gotten a little bit better, but it still has a long way to go. I wish I could say that I knew what the answer was, or that there was a single root cause to it. I'll emphasize that landmarking is not the problem, but it's vexing a lot of different parts of the city. In fact, looking at the controller's report this morning, he showed that actually the retail vacancy rates were way higher in places like Staten Island and some other parts of the city, although obviously we do have some corridors with some really bad problems like that. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering about a particular building that's on Fifth Avenue, that's in the landmark district, a 5-story double brownstone between 8th and 9th Street on Fifth Avenue. That,
14 Fifth Avenue.
Number 14. That they're proposing to make a 28-story needle going up and demolishing, not even using it as facade, but demolishing the whole building.
Right.
How can they even start to say that?
Well, it's a good question, one that I've heard from a lot of people. Nobody can prevent anybody from saying what they want. That doesn't mean they're going to get to do it. So for those of you who are not familiar with this proposal or idea, a couple of years ago it was leaked or revealed or what have you that there were plans being generated by the new owner of 14 Fifth Avenue. So as mentioned, it actually used to be, remember I showed you that beautifully restored Gothic former mansion on Fifth Avenue and 8th Street? One building to the north of that. It used to look like that. It used to look like two of them. It now has a sort of plain, stripped facade. But it was a similar mansion on Fifth Avenue that many years ago was combined into 2 apartment buildings. And a new owner internally had come up with plans to demolish the building and build a 350-foot tall tower on the site. He has not ever filed an application with either the Department of Buildings or the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which he would have to do, and go through a public hearing process, which I can guarantee you would attract a lot of attention and a lot of vocal opposition from us and probably everybody in this room and many, many, many others. When the new chair of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, Sarah Carroll, came in, I met with her within her first 2 weeks or so of her tenure. And when we sat down to meet, that was the first thing that I talked to her about. I said, we do not want to see this happen. What have you heard? What do you know? And basically what she told me was, we haven't seen anything. All we know is what you know, what's been in the press. So whether this was some fantasy or something that they're kind of slow walking, or they wanted to put this crazy thing out there first and they're going to ask for something a little more modest later on, we don't know, but they haven't made any concrete moves in that direction. And there's two hurdles that they would have to go through. They would have to prove to the commission and get the commission to agree that the building that's there now is not historically significant and could be demolished. We've already submitted research and documentation to the commission arguing why they should not allow that to happen in anticipation of this possibility. And then they would have to get the commission to agree that the replacement building is appropriate for the district. It's a tough fight. It would be a tough fight on their part, but I would take nothing for granted. And all I can say is, if we hear anything about that moving, trust me, we will let everybody know, and we will need you and want you there with us to fight to make sure that that doesn't happen. Sir? That's a good one. So yes, the Strand bookstore controversy. So the Strand is located in one of those 7 buildings in that non-landmarked area that we've been fighting to get landmarked, that the commission recently decided to landmark. It's one of the 7 buildings that they decided to landmark. All of the owners of all of the other buildings were either neutral or supportive of landmarking. The owner of the Strand, who I know very well and have known for years, and I love and admire in many ways, but we disagree about this, or at least some aspects of this, has been a vociferous opponent of being landmarked. She's claimed that it will ruin her business, it will cost her, untold amounts of money, that it will, put them out of business, all this sort of stuff. I have to say, the amount of money she's been spending on her legal and PR campaign against it, no doubt is way more than any filing fees that would come along with being landmarked. Now, as you can see from this over here, in fact, small independent businesses actually do very well in landmarked areas. I'm not saying there isn't an additional layer of bureaucracy. I'm not saying that there aren't some things that you have a little less freedom to do, but there's a lot of benefits that you get from being in a landmark district or a landmark building. And in fact, we're embarking on a process right now, which actually T behind the camera there is very familiar with, a project that involves speaking to business owners in landmarked areas about their experience with landmark designation, which we found has been largely very positive. What I will say that Nancy and I agree upon is that the commission made the wrong decision to cherry pick 7 buildings that were not endangered and not likely to be going anywhere, instead of looking at a much broader district and prioritizing buildings that actually could be endangered, and something that was big enough to really maintain the sense of place, as opposed to just these 7 individual buildings that, in all likelihood, there was no danger to. Sir?
This does pertain to buildings per se, so may think it's trivial, but when they redid the Gansford area, they removed the original 150, perhaps even older, speech stones, the paving stones, and put in new rough cut ones. When I inquired about it, they said the old ones were a regular shape, so they couldn't put them back in. They managed to put them in 150 years ago. And now on Greenwich Street, we went into doing some infrastructure work. And I don't know what they've done with the stones. I know they're very valuable. They probably sold them. Began to rental when they stopped it. And as they finish with the radio sheet, I don't know if they're going to put them back.
So this is an issue that comes up a lot in our area, and definitely we, like many of you, feel passionate about cobblestone preservation. The cobblestones in the street are regulated by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Thank you, Judy. And it's complicated, and we could have a more involved story about it, a conversation about it. But here's what I will say: One of the challenges which came up specifically in Gansevoort, and Sarah, who worked on that, might sort of correct me on any of this, is that there are ADA accessibility issues. So one of the things that they had to try to do was to make it so that the crosswalks were navigable by people with disabilities. And with the old-fashioned cobblestones, that's hard to do. So that's part of what we were up against. There are different requirements, and they're adhered to different degrees in terms of who's replacing cobblestones, about whether or not you have to put back the ones that were there, replace them in kind, replace it with something new. What I will say is, and we could actually, and we probably should actually, have a whole program about cobblestones and what the challenges are that they face and how to preserve them. It's definitely something we pay a lot of attention to. I can't tell you how much time Sarah and I have both spent on the phone with the Department of Transportation about cobblestones being removed and replaced, and whether or not they're going to be put back the right way. It's an important part of what makes those streets feel unique and special. It's why film companies come to make films. It's why stores want to locate there. It's a worthwhile investment. I know it's a little more expensive. I know it's more work to get them back in place and to look that way. But beyond the aesthetics, there's good reasons to do it, and it's something we continue to push the city and the private companies on as well. So, yes?
I've been holding my breath for years now on 8th Street between MacDougal, right off the corner of MacDougal Street. A whole stretch of empty buildings, storefront, street level, has been empty for a very long time, and I'm hoping has there been any thought about what's happening there?
Yes, somebody has not been reading their village preservation emails. So there was an application for a new building on that corner, which went through the process, and it was approved with some changes. So the little I guess they're all one-story buildings, those are all going to go. On MacDougal Street, the older buildings, like the 4-story buildings next to it, they're actually going to be fairly nicely restored. The original plan was not quite as good as the final plan that was done there, but we pushed for some changes, which the commission did agree with. But the 1-story buildings are going to be replaced with a new building, which will have stores on the ground floor and apartments above it.
How many floors?
5, 6? Yeah. If you go onto our website, so by the way, one of the great things that we do on our website is every one of these public hearing applications, anywhere in our neighborhoods, not just the Greenwich Village Historic District, we have a huge webpage, gbshp.org/LPC for Landmarks Preservation Commission. You can see every single one of these applications, find out what was proposed, what was changed, what was approved. So just go there. You can find it on the map. You can either search by map or just look it up by address, and it'll have all the information. If you can't find it, just email us and we'll send you the link. Yes?
The stretch of 6th Avenue between Waverly Place and 8th Street has been stagnant for a long time. It sits right on top of the transit hub. And it seems curious in this era of heavy development that there hasn't been some activity there. Has that been a landmarks issue? Is that a real estate issue?
So this is, which part of 6th Avenue?
Between Waverly and 8th, a lot of vendors on the street, and it's the old Barnes & Noble that's been closed for many years.
So I'm going to actually, if she's willing, ask Terry from the Village Alliance bid, because I know she knows more about what's going on there than I do. It's definitely not a landmarks issue. Landmarks is not preventing them from occupying those stores or developing. I think there might be different things going on in different spaces. If I'm not mistaken, at the corner where the bookstore used to be, actually Terry told me this, they have a lease, they're just not using it there, so that's why it's empty. Do you want to say more?
So the old Barnes & Noble space, TD Bank leased it 5 years ago? They're paying $200,000 a month. It's leased. They signed the lease, they decided to get out of a couple of large leases. So the landlord really has no motivation. They're making $200,000 a month. So TD Bank is trying to sublet it, they have not been successful. On the opposite corner, the Dwayne Reed has been leased to a gourmet grocery called Tashkent. They're in Brooklyn now, so that's leased, they're working on it. Staples has been a struggle. They keep almost finding a tenant, and then they drop out. So those are the three big energy ones right there.
Yeah, that definitely has been an area of concern, and I just want to thank the Village Alliance for their great work and partnership with us on the project.
And there was some talk about a music venue coming into the Barnes & Noble space. In fact, there was a dispute about whether they would be allowed to have music on the roof and other
They
things.
seem to have dropped out at this present time.
Ma'am,
Yeah, I have a question about land.
okay.
An area like, wonderful, perfect West Village area, Greenwich Street, Perry, Charles. Charles, at either end, has two big empty lots, ugly blights, that have been there forever and ever, and to any member of the public, and a front. I mean, there's no dispute about that. Now, one of the lots is part of the Gottlieb blight that we've lived with for a long time. We've lived in the village for a long time. And if we walk dogs in that area. So, two ugly big lots. One at Charles and
Charles and Washington. And what's the other
and
one?
the other, the Gottlieb blight, where supposedly,
Is this Charles and Hudson?
yeah.
Okay, yes.
Now,
So,
now, with that one, apparently, maybe they're gonna start renovating.
so they went through the process and they did get approval for this building that we had looked at. Now, that's not a guarantee that they're gonna build it. Here we go. This one.
Yeah.
So that is supposed to be built there. When they will build that, I don't know.
For decades, it's been a blight.
It's not, yeah.
Gottlieb.
What I can tell you is there's nothing that forces somebody to build there. There are rules extending beyond landmarking rules about if you're not taking proper care of a property. For Charles and Washington,
Yeah.
in a similar way, different developer also got approval for a new building there years ago and has just never built, and I
Is there
don't
no
know why.
recourse? Is there nothing?
You can't force somebody to build. There are certain things, though, if they're not taking appropriate care of their property, if there's dangerous conditions, if there's unhealthy conditions, there are some things that can be done about that. If it's in a landmark district, which both of those are, and there's a historic building on the property that's being allowed to deteriorate, which in both of those cases really isn't the case, there's certain actions that the Landmarks Preservation Commission could take. But I would say is, why don't we try to connect afterwards, and I can talk to you about what some of the other remedies are out there for some of those other kinds of issues. Sure. Sir, in the back.
Yes. Would it be worthwhile for Greenwich Village Association to support commercial rent control? Would it be in the interest of this organization?
So, first of all, we'll call it Village Preservation. Thank you. We've been doing a lot of work around small business preservation, and we've actually been supportive and a leader on quite a few measures that have been actively before the City Council and the state legislature. One is called the Small Business Jobs Survival Act, which would help small businesses in terms of being able to stay in place and negotiate fair and equitable leases. We've also been working on trying to generate some zoning proposals that would limit the proliferation of chain stores. Currently, there is not a bill, an active bill for commercial rent control. If there was one that was proposed, we would look at it. I think realistically, I don't think that's where the city is at right now in terms of the remedies that seem to be within the ballpark of possibility. And one of the things that we do want to do is we actually want to see something happen that there is a chance of happening. All of that said, we're open to all ideas and all possibilities, and I think that without a doubt, right now it's a really challenging environment for a lot of small businesses, and more does need to be done to help protect them and promote them. We also run something called the Business of the Month program, where you can nominate a favorite local business, and we then promote them and celebrate them during that month. We send information out about them to 15,000 people. It's a great way to kind of spread the word about these businesses that we want to see, live on in our neighborhood. So, let me just see if there's anyone who hasn't asked a question or made a comment yet. Anybody who hasn't yet that wants to? Yes?
Talk about neglected property, the village infirmary, historic building, it's been in limbo for years.
Yes, also our friends, the Gottliebs.
Rotting away, I went there once to the dentist, and I pass all the time, and it's just, I don't know what condition the roof is in, but...
Well, here's what I can tell you. First of all, does everyone know what this is? The Northern Dispensary at the corner of Waverly and Grove, or Washington Place, where Edgar Allan Poe back in the day went for medical care. It was called the Northern Dispensary because there was it was north of the city at the time, and there was a dispensary in New York. It was originally built in 1827. It's a sort of trapezoidal building, and it's been sitting vacant for 20 more plus years, at least 25 years now. A long, tortured history there in terms of what happened. There was a dental clinic. They refused to serve people with AIDS, so it was eventually closed by the city or the state. Then there was a plan to turn it into an AIDS hospice, which was approved but very controversial and eventually dropped. Then the Gottlieb estate, first Bill Gottlieb and then his estate, became the owners of it, and as they do, they've just been sitting on the property for years and years and years now. What I will tell you is there's a lot of attention paid to it, and then I happen to know that a couple of years ago, the estate did actually hire a very, very reputable architect to examine the building to make sure that it was in good condition, to do a sort of conditions assessment, to make sure that it was at least being taken care of. I know that there have been a few events in the building, actually, over the years. There have been some kind of fundraiser galas held in the building, sometimes to the consternation of neighbors. So it's not entirely unused, but that's obviously the exception, not the rule. It would make a great museum. You're not the only person to have thought of that. There is a deed restriction on the building, however, that says that it has to be utilized for the dispensing of medicine to the poor and indigent. So that that's one of the factors that are involved here. So its future remains to be seen. If there is any clear evidence of that building falling apart, being compromised in any way, we would go to the commission and say, you have the power to intervene, and they do have the power to intervene. It's rarely used, but it exists. The evidence we have indicates that that's not the case, but it is not a good situation to have a historic building sitting there for 25 years. Eventually, it's going to start to come undone, but they have at least taken some basic measures to keep it in decent shape. To be continued. Judy.
This is somewhat adjacent to your issue, to your mission, rather, but I think this issue possibly could be looked at by village preservation. About 15 years ago, a tenement, a new owner of a tenement in the East Village wanted to convert the whole building to private residence. Now, at the lower court level, under Judge Paul Feynman, the ruling was correct. Unfortunately, at the appeal level, that was reversed, and even more unfortunate is that that means that there is now case law. Is there a legislative redress to this, and can village preservation get involved in such an effort?
So this is an interesting question. This was sort of the first of what then ended up becoming many of these cases where somebody who owned a tenement in the East Village on East 3rd Street, I believe, said that they were going to utilize what's called the personal use eviction process, which even in a rent-stabilized building, you can kick out all of the tenants if you say that you are using the units for personal use, meaning to house either you or your family. There was a lot of disbelief that he needed every unit in this entire tenement building, a 6-story building, for him and his family, but he went to court and he eventually won, and he did it, and if I'm not mistaken, he and or his family do in fact occupy that building. I'm not an expert in this regard. Judy, as you know, though, I've worked on tenant issues over the years. We both have. And if I'm not mistaken, the personal use aspect of the law goes to the state constitution. It might even go to the U.S. Constitution in that there are very severe limits in terms of how property can be regulated. If I'm not mistaken, the courts have always interpreted that if it's for personal use, that cannot be impinged upon by the state. So we've seen this happen more and more frequently, actually, where buildings that were intended to be utilized for many, many families, many, many units, are being consolidated and turned into these single-family mansions. And it's an element of what we're dealing with in our neighborhoods that I think we need to be aware of and think about what the implications are and what, if anything, could or should be done. And I don't know that anybody has a solution or an answer to that at this point. But it's certainly one that we've been aware of. As Sarah can attest to, it's something we've had some conversations about in our preservation committee. So, any other questions or issues people want to bring up? Yes, last one.
Just because I walked down East 11th Street the other day and saw that thing called the MacDougal Hotel.
Yes.
Would you like to just say a word about how the hell that happened?
Yeah, so that's, oh
Speaking
boy.
of getting rid of,
Yeah. Yeah, so on 11th Street, actually, just a block south of that NYU dorm/church that we were looking at, there used to be 5 lovely Beaux-Arts, circa 1890, walk-up tenements with many long-term tenants in it, actually including an old high school friend of mine who grew up there, that were demolished to make way for the recently opened MacDougal Hotel. This is across the street from Webster Hall. So in our mayor's city, where supposedly we are prioritizing affordable housing and getting rid of the tale of two cities, all of these permanent affordable housing units were demolished by, coincidentally, a donor to the mayor's campaign. What's even more interesting is that the buildings had been ruled landmark eligible by the Landmarks Preservation Commission in 2008. When we became aware that there were these plans to demolish them, we brought that to the attention of the commission. We said, hey, here are these landmark eligible buildings. It's now or never. Landmark them and keep them from being demolished. And the commission said, oh, we didn't really mean it when we said they were landmark eligible. We don't think they're worthy of landmark designation. We're going to let them be demolished. And they did. And there is a 12-story hotel, 13-story maybe, hotel in its place. And we worked very, very, very hard to try to get the city to agree that when they rezoned the plot of land on 14th Street for the tech hub between 3rd and 4th Avenue, which is just directly north of this site and many of these other sites that we were talking about, that along with that, they would either rezone or landmark this whole area to the south that we've been talking about that is so vulnerable to out-of-scale development, and that if the mayor wanted his tech hub on 14th Street, here we go, that we should get this area landmarked and protected so that the tech hub would not accelerate the destruction of this area. And the council member who represents the area, Carlina Rivera, when she ran for city council, promised that that's exactly what she would do. That she would only vote for that tech hub development and rezoning if the mayor came through with these protections for the neighborhood. She voted for the tech hub. We do not have the protections. And we are not very happy about that, and we are reminding her of that at every turn. And we are offering her every opportunity to redeem herself. She has not done so yet, but hope springs eternal, and so does our willingness to keep reminding her of the promise that she made and to do so in a very public way. So that is the story with the Moxie Hotel.